I was 20 years old when I hit Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, carrying a Browning automatic rifle that weighed almost 20 pounds fully loaded. And I remember thinking that if I died in the next 10 minutes, at least my ma wouldn't have to pretend she was proud of me anymore. The bar was my burden and my responsibility, the kind of weapon they gave you when they figured you could handle the weight and the attention that came with being the guy who had to lay down suppressing fire when everything went to hell. I was a private first class in Dog Company, 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, and I had exactly 8 months of training before they put me on a ship bound for England with 2,000 other kids who didn't know what real fear felt like yet. My squad leader was a staff sergeant from Pittsburgh named Kowalski, a man in his early 30s, who seemed ancient to us because he had a wife and 2 kids back home, and because he'd been in the army since 1940, when most of us were still in high school. He had this way of looking at you that made you feel like he could see right through whatever brave face you were trying to put on, and he'd told us during the Channel crossing that the first minute on that beach would be the longest minute of our lives. "You're gonna want to stay in the boat," he said while we were packed like sardines in the hold, the smell of diesel and vomit so thick you could taste it. "You're gonna want to hide behind that ramp, but the boat's a coffin if you stay in it. The only way you survive is forward, and even then, most of you won't make it past the waterline." Nobody slept that night, not really, and the ones who did had nightmares that made them wake up shouting, until somebody told them to shut the hell up. I checked my bar maybe 50 times, counting the 20 rounds in my magazine, and the 4 spare magazines in my bandolier, doing the math in my head, even though I knew it was pointless, because you could never carry enough ammunition for what we were about to do. The bar fired 30 .06 Springfield rounds, the same caliber as the M1 Garand, but with the capability to go full automatic when you needed it, which meant you could burn through a magazine in about 4 seconds if you weren't careful. They'd taught us in training to fire in short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds at a time, to keep the barrel from overheating and to make your ammo last. But they'd also told us that in combat, everything you learned in training would feel like a joke. We loaded into the LCVP at 5:30 hours, the Higgins boat rocking so violently in the channel that half the guys were puking before we even got within sight of the beach, and I remember thinking that drowning might be better than whatever was waiting for us on that sand. The British coxswain steering the boat kept yelling at us to keep our heads down and stay tight, but there were 32 of us crammed into a space meant for 30, and we were carrying so much gear that if anyone fell overboard, they'd sink like a stone. I had my bar, my bandolier, my M1 helmet, my gas mask that I knew I'd ditch within the first 5 minutes, a life preserver that was supposed to keep me afloat but felt like it would just trap me underwater, and a pack full of rations and ammo that made my spine feel like it was compressing with every wave that hit us. The naval bombardment had started at 0550, the sound of the battleships firing their main guns so loud you could feel it in your chest even from miles away, and for a few minutes we actually believed that maybe they'd blown the Germans to pieces, and we'd just be walking up an empty beach. Kowalski knew better. "Those fortifications were built to survive this," he said, barely audible over the sound of the engines and the waves and the constant thunder of the naval guns. "Reinforced concrete 6 feet thick. The only thing that bombardment's doing is making them mad." We were in the first wave, the ones they expected to take the heaviest losses, and as we got closer to shore, I could see the obstacles in the water, the Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates that were designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. And I could see the wooden stakes with teller mines attached that were supposed to blow us all to pieces if we hit them at the wrong angle. The coxswain was doing his best to thread us through the mess, but I saw a boat to our left hit a mine and disappear in a column of water and flame. 30 men gone in the time it takes to blink. And that's when I realized that Kowalski was right about everything. The ramp dropped at around 0630, and the first 3 guys off the boat were cut down before their boots hit the water. The sound of the MG42 like a buzzsaw that you could hear, even over the naval guns and the surf and the screaming. I was 5th in line, and by the time I got to the ramp there were already bodies floating in the water, men from my own squad who I'd been playing cards with the night before, and the water was so cold it felt like knives going into my legs. I was chest deep within 2 steps, holding my bar over my head to keep it dry, trying to keep my footing on sand that shifted with every wave, and the bullets were hitting the water all around me, making these little geysers that looked almost pretty until you realized what they were. Kowalski was yelling something about moving to the right, toward a cluster of beach obstacles that might give us some cover, but the radio operator next to me took a round through the throat and went down, still trying to transmit, the handset floating away on a wave that was turning pink with blood. I pushed forward because that's what you do, because staying still means dying, and I made it maybe 20 yards before I realized that the beach was longer than it looked from the boat, and that we had 300 yards of open sand to cross before we reached anything resembling cover. The machine gun fire was coming from everywhere, from bunkers and pillboxes and trenches we couldn't see, but the worst of it was coming from a position up on the bluffs to our left, maybe 200 yards away, and maybe 80 feet up, where a concrete bunker with a perfect field of fire was just shredding everything that moved. I could see the traces, 1 in every 5 rounds glowing red as they cut through the air, and I could see men falling in groups, whole squads wiped out in seconds, and the sand was littered with bodies and equipment, and pieces of bodies that I tried not to look at. I made it to the seawall, a concrete barrier maybe 4 feet high that ran along the edge of the beach, and I threw myself behind it with maybe 15 other guys from different units, all of us gasping and shaking and trying to figure out if we were actually alive. Kowalski was there, bleeding from a graze across his shoulder, and he was trying to organize us into something resembling a fighting force, even though half the guys were in shock and the other half looked like they were about to bolt back into the water. "We can't stay here," he kept saying, shouting to be heard over the constant roar of gunfire. "They're going to drop mortars on us any minute. We have to move up." But moving up meant crossing another 50 yards of open ground to reach the base of the bluffs, and the MG42 nest up there was still pouring fire down onto the beach, and every time someone tried to move, they got cut down. I watched a lieutenant from another company try to rally his men for an advance, and he made it maybe 10 feet, before a burst caught him across the chest, and he went down hard. And after that, nobody wanted to be the first one to move. That's when I really looked at the bunker, trying to figure out its firing angles and its blind spots, and I realized that if we could just suppress it for 30 seconds, maybe a minute, we could get enough people moving that some of us would make it to the bluffs. The problem was that suppressing an MG42 with small arms fire was like trying to stop a freight train with a baseball bat, because that gun could put out 1,200 rounds per minute, and all we had were rifles and a few bars. But I had the bar, and the bar could at least make them duck if I could get close enough and if I could put rounds on target, and maybe that would be enough. I told Kowalski what I was thinking, and he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But then he looked at the beach and the bodies piling up and the men who were drowning in 3 feet of water because they were too wounded to stand, and he nodded. "You get 1 magazine," he said. 20 rounds. You put them right in that firing slit. You make them think about keeping their heads down. And we push as many guys forward as we can. If you miss, you're dead, and so are we. I checked my bar one more time, made sure the bipod was folded and the bolt was seated properly, and I tried to remember everything they'd taught me about firing from an unsupported position under stress. The key was to control your breathing, to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it, to fire in short, controlled bursts, even when every instinct was screaming at you to just hold the trigger down and pray. The bar had a rate of fire around 500 rounds per minute on full auto, which meant my 20-round magazine would last about 2.5 seconds if I wasn't careful, so I had to make every burst count. I waited for a lull in the fire, one of those brief moments when the gunner had to reload or when he was targeting someone else, and then I rolled over the seawall and sprinted toward a crater maybe 30 yards away, running in a crouch with my bar held across my chest. I could feel the rounds cracking past me, could feel the pressure wave of near misses, and I hit the crater doing a belly flop that knocked the wind out of me and filled my mouth with sand and cordite. From there I had a better angle on the bunker, could see the dark rectangular firing slit and the occasional muzzle flash when the MG42 was firing, and I could also see that there were at least 2 guns in there, one on the left side and one on the right, which meant they could cover the entire beach without any real gaps. The left gun was the one that was killing us, the one with the perfect enfilade fire that was sweeping back and forth across the waterline, and that was the one I needed to hit. I settled the bar against the edge of the crater, using the rim as a rest to steady my aim, and I put the front sight post right on that firing slit. The distance was maybe 170 yards, well within the effective range of the bar, but far enough that I needed to account for bullet drop and windage, and I had to fire uphill, which meant adjusting my hold. I took a breath, let half of it out, and I squeezed the trigger for a 3-round burst. The bar kicked hard against my shoulder, the sound of it sharp and distinct even in all the chaos, and I saw my tracers arc toward the bunker, and 2 of them went right through the firing slit. I didn't wait to see if I'd hit anything, just adjusted my aim slightly and fired another burst, another 3 rounds, and then another. I was firing slow and deliberate, giving myself time between bursts to correct my aim, and I could see the concrete around the firing slit starting to chip and crack where my rounds were impacting. Then something changed. The MG42 stopped firing just for a second, and I saw movement in the darkness behind the slit, and I knew I'd at least made them worried. I fired 2 more bursts, putting 6 more rounds into that opening, and I was down to my last 8 rounds when I saw Kowalski and about 20 other guys break from the seawall and start running toward the bluffs. I kept firing, emptying the rest of my magazine into that bunker, and I saw the right side gun try to track toward our guys, but my fire was making them flinch, making them pull their shots high, and by the time my bolt locked back on an empty magazine, about half our guys had made it to the base of the bluffs. I rolled back into the crater to reload, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the fresh magazine, and when I looked up again, the left side gun was searching for me. I could see the tracers walking toward my position, could see the sand erupting in little fountains as the gunner tried to zero in on where I'd been firing from, and I knew I had maybe 3 seconds before he figured out exactly where I was. I grabbed my bar and rolled out of the crater on the opposite side, scrambling toward another depression maybe 15 yards away, and I felt something punch me in the leg just as I dove for cover. It took me a second to realize I'd been hit, the pain not really registering at first, just a weird numbness that spread from my right thigh down to my knee. I looked down and saw blood soaking through my pants, not spurting but flowing steady, and I knew it wasn't arterial, but it was bad enough that I needed to do something about it fast. I pulled a compress from my first aid pouch and pressed it against the wound, trying to tie it in place with a bandage while keeping my head down, and that's when I saw that the right side gun had shifted its fire away from the beach to target the guys who'd made it to the bluffs. They were pinned there trying to find a way up the cliff face, and the MG42 was chewing into them from above. I could see Kowalski down there, waving his arms and pointing, trying to coordinate something, and I knew that if that gun kept firing, we were going to lose everyone who'd made the run. I had 3 magazines left, 60 rounds, and my leg hurt like hell, but I could still move and I could still shoot. I low-crawled to a new position, closer to the bluffs but at an angle that gave me a better view of the bunker, and I could see now that there was a 3rd firing position we hadn't noticed, a machine gun nest dug into the hillside, about 50 yards to the left of the main bunker. That gun wasn't firing yet, probably because they were waiting for more targets, but I could see the crew moving around in there, and I knew that if they opened up, we'd be completely flanked. I made a decision. I loaded a fresh magazine into my bar, set the fire selector to full automatic, and I came up out of my cover running toward that hillside position. I don't know why I did it, don't know if it was bravery or stupidity, or just the fact that I was so pumped full of adrenaline that I wasn't thinking straight, but I covered maybe 40 yards before they saw me coming. The crew tried to swing their gun around, an MG34 it looked like, but I was already firing, holding the trigger down and walking my fire right into their position. The bar was jumping in my hands, the barrel climbing as the recoil pushed it up, and I could see my rounds hitting the sandbags and the dirt and the men behind the gun. I emptied the entire 20-round magazine in less than 3 seconds, and by the time the bolt locked back, I was close enough to see the damage I'd done. 2 of them were down, not moving, and the 3rd was trying to crawl away with half his chest missing, and the gun was tilted at a crazy angle with the belt feed jammed and useless. I dropped down next to the position, reloading with my second-to-last magazine, and I realized I could see into the main bunker from here, could see the gun crews moving around and the officers shouting orders, and the stacks of ammunition cans piled against the walls. I started putting rounds through the access door, short controlled bursts this time because I needed to make my ammo last, and I could see people scrambling for cover inside. The left side gun stopped firing completely, the crew either dead or smart enough to realize they were exposed, and that gave our guys at the base of the bluffs the opening they needed. I saw Kowalski leading a group up a narrow ravine, using the terrain to shield themselves from the remaining gun positions, and I saw engineers moving forward with Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the wire. The right side gun was still firing, but it was panicked now, spraying rounds without really aiming, and I could tell they knew something had gone wrong. I fired my last magazine at the bunker, putting all 20 rounds through that door, and then my bar was empty and I was out of ammunition except for my sidearm, a .45 automatic that I'd barely even practiced with. I stayed in that position for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, watching as more men made it off the beach and started climbing the bluffs, as engineers blew the wire and tanks finally rolled in to support us, as the German positions started taking fire from destroyers that had come in close enough to risk running aground. The main bunker took a direct hit from a 5-inch naval gun, and part of the roof collapsed, smoke and dust billowing out of the firing slits, and I saw men running out of the back entrance, only to get cut down by rifle fire from our guys who'd made it to the top of the bluffs. By 800 hours the beach was secured, or as secured as a beach can be when there are still snipers in the draws and mortar teams in the inland hedgerows, and I finally let myself feel how bad my leg was. A medic found me in the machine gun nest, surrounded by German dead and spent brass casings, and he gave me a shot of morphine that made everything soft and distant. "You did good, kid," he said while he was working on my leg, cutting away my pants to expose the wound. "This is gonna hurt like hell for a while, but you'll walk again." They evacuated me back to England on a hospital ship, and I spent the next 6 weeks in a bed, watching other wounded guys come through and learning that we'd taken over 2,000 casualties on Omaha Beach that day. That whole companies had been wiped out in the first 15 minutes. That the reason we'd eventually succeeded was because of guys like Kowalski who just kept pushing forward no matter what. I found out later that he'd made it all the way to the top of the bluffs and had knocked out 2 more machine gun positions before taking shrapnel from a mortar round, and that he'd died on the way to the aid station still trying to tell his men what to do. They gave me a Silver Star for taking out that hillside position and a Purple Heart for the leg wound, and they sent me back to my unit in August after I'd healed enough to walk without crutches. But I never fired my bar the same way again after that day. Never felt the same confidence in it, because I kept thinking about all the guys who'd died before I'd managed to suppress that bunker, all the guys who'd drowned in 3 feet of water, or who'd bled out on the sand while I was still trying to figure out how to shoot uphill. I made it through the rest of the war, survived the push through France and the Battle of the Bulge and the crossing of the Rhine, but I never forgot those first 10 minutes on Omaha Beach, never forgot the sound of the MG42 or the feeling of my bar bucking against my shoulder, or the look on Kowalski's face when he told me I had 1 magazine to make it work. I came home in October of 1945 with a limp that never fully went away, and a drawer full of medals that I never showed anyone, and for years I couldn't watch the ocean without seeing bodies in the surf. People ask me sometimes if I was scared that day, if I thought I was going to die, and I tell them the truth, which is that I was too busy to be scared, too focused on making my shots count and keeping my bar functioning and trying to remember my training. The fear came later, in the quiet moments when I had time to think about what could have gone wrong, about how many different ways I could have been killed, about how much luck I'd needed just to survive those first 30 seconds off the boat. The thing about the bar that nobody tells you until you've carried one in combat is that it's not just a weapon, it's a responsibility. Because when things go bad, you're the one everyone looks to for covering fire. You're the one who's supposed to keep the enemy's heads down while your buddies advance, the one who's supposed to lay into fortified positions and give the assault teams a chance to close distance. And that means you're also the one who lives with it if you fail. If your fire isn't accurate enough or sustained enough, or you run out of ammo at the wrong moment. I think about that bunker a lot, about the men I killed in those few seconds of sustained fire, and I wonder if they had families waiting for them back in Germany, or if they were just scared kids like me who'd been told they were defending their homeland. I wonder if the guy operating that left side gun ever knew what hit him, if he saw my tracers coming, or if he just suddenly went dark when my rounds found him. I wonder if it would have made any difference if I'd fired sooner, or if I'd aimed better, or if I'd had more ammunition. The 30-06 rounds from my bar traveled at about 2,700 feet per second, which meant they covered the distance to that bunker in less than 1/5 of a second. And in that fraction of time I changed the trajectory of everything that happened on that section of beach. Maybe 50 guys made it to the bluffs because I suppressed that gun, and some of them went on to take the villages beyond the beach, and some of them made it all the way to Berlin, and some of them are probably still alive today with grandkids who don't know that their existence is owed in part to a 20-year-old kid from Ohio who got lucky with a Browning automatic rifle on June 6, 1944. I kept my bar after the war ended, or rather I kept one like it, bought from an army surplus store in 1952 after they'd been decommissioned and sold off. It hangs on my wall now, deactivated and harmless, but sometimes I take it down and feel the weight of it, and remember what it felt like to shoulder that weapon and know that everything depended on whether I could make my shots count. It weighs the same as it always did, just under 20 pounds, but somehow it feels heavier now than it did then. The MG42 that pinned us on that beach could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, which meant it could theoretically empty a 250-round belt in about 12.5 seconds. And I've done the math enough times to know that during the time we were pinned down, that gun probably fired somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 rounds. My bar, firing in controlled 3-round bursts, probably put 70 rounds toward that bunker in total, and somehow those 70 rounds were enough to make the difference. That's what I try to explain when people ask me about D-Day, when they want to hear about the heroics and the glory and the triumph of good over evil. I tell them there wasn't any glory, just a beach full of dead men and a lot of scared kids trying to stay alive long enough to complete their mission. I tell them about the weight of the bar and the smell of blood mixed with seawater, and the sound of men screaming for medics who couldn't reach them. I tell them about Kowalski and the radio operator and the lieutenant who died trying to lead a charge, and the 1,000 other guys whose names I never learned who went into the water that morning and never came back out. And I tell them about those few seconds when I was firing at that bunker, when the whole war seemed to come down to whether I could keep my hands steady and my breathing controlled and my aim true, when the difference between success and failure was measured in inches and fractions of seconds. That's what combat is really like. Not the sweeping movements of armies across maps or the grand strategies of generals in war rooms, but individual moments when everything depends on whether one kid with one weapon can do his job when it counts. I'm 82 years old now as I'm telling you this, and my leg still aches when it rains, and I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I can hear the sound of that MG42, that distinctive buzzsaw roar that meant death was sweeping across the beach. My hands shake now from age rather than adrenaline, but I can still feel the kick of that bar against my shoulder, can still remember the precise pressure you needed on the trigger to fire a 3-round burst, can still see my tracers arcing through the air toward that firing slit. They tell me I'm a hero, that I saved lives that day, that I helped turn the tide on Omaha Beach. But I don't feel like a hero. I feel like a guy who got lucky, who survived when better men didn't, who happened to be in the right place with the right weapon at the right moment, and who managed not to screw it up. The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it off that beach, the ones who drowned under the weight of their equipment, or who took a bullet in the first few seconds, or who died on the sand while I was still trying to get my bearings. Kowalski was a hero, pushing his men forward even after he'd been hit, dying while trying to complete the mission. The engineers who blew the wire were heroes, working under direct fire to clear obstacles. The medics who ran into the open to treat wounded men were heroes, and most of them died doing it. Me? I just had a bar and 20 rounds and a desperation born from watching my friends die around me, and I pointed it at the right target and pulled the trigger until the magazine was empty. That's what war is in the end. Not grand gestures or impossible acts of courage, but small desperate actions repeated over and over until either you win or you die. The 30.06 rounds in my bar didn't care about ideology or patriotism or any of the reasons we'd been told we were fighting. They just flew straight and hit hard and did their job, and that was enough. It had to be enough, because nothing else was going to save us. I think about that sometimes, about how something as simple as 20 rifle rounds fired at the right moment in the right direction could change the course of a battle, could save dozens of lives, could be the difference between success and catastrophic failure. And I think about all the other moments in that war, and every war where similar small actions decided everything, where one soldier with one weapon in one critical instant either made the right choice or didn't, and how we only remember the ones who succeeded. There were probably other guys on that beach with bars who tried to do what I did and failed, who missed their shots or got killed before they could fire, or whose weapons jammed at the critical moment, and nobody knows their names because dead men don't get silver stars. I got lucky, that's the truth of it, the part that makes me uncomfortable when people call me brave or heroic. I got lucky that my bar didn't jam. Lucky that I found decent cover. Lucky that the German gunners didn't see me soon enough. Lucky that my rounds found their mark. But I also did my job. I trained with that weapon for 8 months, learned its quirks and its capabilities, learned how to field strip it in the dark and how to clear a jam, and how to estimate range and adjust for wind. When the moment came, I didn't freeze and I didn't panic and I didn't waste my ammunition. And maybe that counts for something. Maybe being a soldier isn't about being fearless or indestructible, but about being scared to death and doing your job anyway, because that's what the guy next to you is counting on. The bar's 30.06 rounds silenced that MG42 nest in seconds, just like the title of this story says. But it took years for me to understand what that really meant. It meant that I killed men who were probably following orders just like I was. Men who probably had mothers and girlfriends and dreams of going home. It meant that I lived with the knowledge that my survival came at the cost of their deaths, and that there's no easy way to reconcile that. It meant carrying the weight of those moments for the rest of my life, feeling the kick of that bar every time I closed my eyes, hearing the sound of rounds impacting concrete and flesh. I wouldn't trade what I did, wouldn't go back and choose differently even if I could, because those rounds I fired gave good men a chance to live and complete their mission. But I also wouldn't call it a victory, not in any simple sense. We won the battle and eventually we won the war, but the cost was staggering, and anyone who was there on that beach understands that war isn't glorious or heroic or anything like what they show in the movies. Okay, it's brutal and chaotic, and it reduces human beings to targets and numbers and acceptable losses. The MG42 was a fearsome weapon, technically superior to anything we had, capable of putting out twice the rate of fire of our machine guns with better reliability and easier barrel changes. The Germans had better tactics too, better fields of fire, better fortifications. They should have held that beach, should have driven us back into the sea and cost us so many lives that we'd never try another amphibious assault. They had every advantage except one. They were fighting guys who'd crossed an ocean to get there and who weren't going back without finishing what they came to do. That's what I think about when I look at my bar on the wall, when I remember those few seconds of firing at that bunker. I think about the determination it took to keep pulling that trigger while bullets were cracking past my head, the focus it took to aim while my leg was bleeding and my hands were shaking and everything in my body was screaming at me to find cover and stay down. I think about Kowalski and all the other guys who showed that same determination, that same unwillingness to quit, even when quitting seemed like the only rational choice. They pinned my squad on Omaha Beach that morning, that German machine gun crew doing exactly what they'd been trained to do. And for a few minutes, it looked like we were going to be one more failed assault, one more group of bodies washing up on the tide. But my bar's rounds found their mark, silenced that gun long enough for good men to advance. And that made all the difference. Not because I was special or because I was brave, but because I was there with the right tool at the right moment, and I didn't waste the opportunity. That's my story from Omaha Beach, the truth of it, without the polish or the propaganda. 20 rounds from a Browning automatic rifle, fired by a scared kid who didn't want to die, suppressing a German machine gun long enough for a squad to reach cover. It's not the stuff of legends, not really, but it's what actually happened on June 6, 1944, and sometimes I think that's more important than any legend could be.